There are probably as many sources of inspiration for artists as there are artists, but in this video I'm going to share with you a few of my own artworks which have been directly influenced by other artists, not because I want to emulate them, but because they speak to me profoundly in some way. It was interesting to see how a student in one of my recent charcoal drawing workshops gained inspiration from an artwork of mine she had seen, I suspect without even realizing it. Now, this is her practice drawing where she's playing with the different materials. And while she was doing that, I happened to be showing another student a drill press work I'd done in ink. So when the students began to work on their final piece, this is what she came up with. Isn't that interesting? You can see the similarity, especially in the way that her dots, even though they're much larger than my dots, but they recede and hide behind the circular images above and below. Very interesting. And this was her first drawing, which has that loose, swirly shape, but there aren't too many dots at all. Now we have the dots. It's promising to be a really lovely piece of work. And I plan to do a future video on abstract charcoal drawing. It's a lot of fun to do. It's messy, but it opens our eyes to the role tone alone plays in our perception. And because I insist on using large sheets of paper, it can be very freeing in terms of technique, which can become quite tight on smaller surfaces. So allow me to share with you my first painting of the three that we're going to look at. This is entitled Beyond, Beyond, Are You There? And if you know your art history, you'll recognize that the white images have been drawn directly from the famous work Guernica by Pablo Picasso. It was painted in response to the 1937 bombing by the Nazis of the town called Guernica in northern Spain, after which it was sent on tour to raise funds for the Spanish war relief effort. This painting was my own response to another war on a different continent to Europe, where Picasso lived, and Australia, where I lived. And that continent was Africa. The country was Rwanda. The year was 1994, and the newspapers were plastered, of course, in images from the ongoing civil war between the Tutsi and Hutu tribes. One of those images was of a child or a young man peering through a hole in the tent with an expression of abject fear on his face. It really disturbed me. Images are powerful, and newspapers thrive on photos of dramatic and violent events to which one can't help responding unless one's totally insensitive to the plight of other human beings. I needed to place this image on the canvas to acknowledge the fact that this child and I, while occupying the same planet, have a totally different environment in which to live, or in his case, to just survive. The relative ease, beauty, peace, space, and freedom of my life stood in stark contrast to the tension, fear, ugliness, stress, and confinement of that child's existence. So the images of Guernica came to mind. They seemed all the more powerful because they are so expressive, and they really encapsulate the horror of violence and war, especially the faces looking upward, the figure up to the far right, reaching up to the sky, pleading to God. The horse, obviously terrified, maybe having been shot or just terrified by the noise. The bull to the left, which is nothing to do with my painting, although I put it in, but that's the symbol of Spain, and the figure underneath it screaming up to heaven with a child in her arms. It's so incredibly powerful. I felt that I couldn't match Picasso's genius in expressing that, but I needed to get something out of my system, so I felt he would probably have forgiven me for adapting his creation with the same intent as his. This work measures 150 by 100 centimetres, only a fraction of the area of Guernica, and I haven't used all of the images, maybe half of them, but I think it still holds that power because of the expression on the child's face and Picasso's images. So there was already a rather vapid painting on the canvas I used of the cliffs overhanging the beach, about 5 minutes walk from our house, and a beautiful azure-coloured sky above. It seemed to capture my life of ease and freedom, the fresh air, the blandness of that existence. Now, this painting is one of my series I call Fractured Landscapes, and I won't describe the thoughts behind this series, but if you go to my website, nairej.com, and click on Sightlines, you can follow it up for yourself if it's of interest to you. However, part of the conception of these fractured images is the idea that we perceive the world in a complex way visually, because while our eyes perceive only what is in front of us, our memories and experience tell us that there is a physical world beyond which we can't see at that moment in time, but resides somehow inside our memory bank. Hence the superimposing of the timelessness and sense of freedom of the beach and sky in my environment, which you can see through the Picasso images and the images of the boy. And the horror, the contrast between that and the horror of this child's environment. Such a paradox, given we share on the same planet. And just to point out, one of the aspects of my fractured landscapes is there's always areas of indigo with blue dots, simply indicating the universe, that we're on a very small planet in a very large universe. This time a portrait of a friend and fellow artist named Caroline, whose lifestyle and taste reminded me of the late famous Australian artist Margaret Olley, who was a fascinating woman. Her home, a former hat factory in inner Sydney, was like an antique shop, full of artefacts and with brightly coloured walls in warm, bright colours, reds and yellows, flowers everywhere, which she painted prolifically. She had a wonderful garden. Hers was a gently flamboyant and gregarious personality. Now, her portrait had been painted by yet another famous Australian artist, William Dobell, and I decided to base my portrait of Caroline on that portrait of Ollie, because I could sense a similarity between the two women in some way. Now, I haven't attempted to copy Dobell's style. I have my own style and technique, and I belong to another generation. But as a tribute to both those fine artists and to my friend, I decided to paint her in the same pose as Margaret Olley and in similar clothing, which I found in Caroline's wardrobe, including the hat, which is a pretty good imitation of Margaret Olley's hat. But you'll see Margaret's colours are all in yellows and there's a bit of salmon in there, whereas Caroline's are more blues and pinks. Now the canvas is exactly the same size as the Olley painting, and she's seated in a very similar pose in an old leather chair, which isn't quite as flamboyant as Olley's chair, but is a reflection of their mutual taste in old things and with history. So Ollie's house is so full of antiques and various objects that moving through the room is similar to moving along a narrow path in a dense jungle. You can see in the painting how close the objects are to her, the tables and other artifacts. Well, that's because in her house they were literally that close to her. And while Caroline's house is not so shambolic, her home is certainly not organised and pristine, and she does have lots of old things, including a very old piano and piano stool that you can see behind her. And it still has lots of character. And the same thing can be said about the personalities of both wonderful women. Caroline isn't famous, but she's certainly a wonderful artist in her own right. And along with her stunning hair, I wanted to celebrate that. And Margaret and William. And thirdly, but not least, another Australian artist whose work speaks to me and to most Australian art lovers very deeply, because he was able to encapsulate the character and atmosphere of the Australian bush in which I grew up and lived most of my life in a totally unique way. His name was Fred Williams. He sadly passed away in 1982 at the early age of 55. But he was an interesting character too. Technically, he wasn't very accomplished and copped some flack for it, but he had a unique vision, and he was on a mission to express that, which he did very successfully. His paintings sell posthumously for millions of dollars now. So his work was very much, as you can see, in a post-impressionist style, probably not because it was the fashion at the time, but because it suited his temperament. The act of painting the world seemed to have a deep spiritual significance for him. And there's one lovely story told by a friend of his who had attended a party at the house of Fred and his wife Lynn. Fred seemed to be absent, so his friend went to look for him and found him sitting on the back step with a canvas under a full moon. Fred was chuckling to himself and apparently had taken off his sweater, which he was using as a painting rag, blissfully unaware of the practicalities of everyday life, such as keeping one's clothes clean, especially free from oil paint, which is impossible to move. And now there are many pseudo Fred Williams paintings out there. People just so love his work they want to copy him, but they're clearly not his work because, after all, it's impossible to accurately copy another artist's style, just as it is almost impossible to forge a signature if you're paying attention to the detail. Capture the moment might have been Fred's motto. The act of painting the world seemed to have a deep spiritual significance for him. And there's one lovely story told by a friend of his who had attended a party at the house of Fred and his wife Lynn. Fred seemed to be absent, so his friend went to look for him and found him sitting on the back step with a canvas under a full moon. Fred was chuckling to himself and apparently had taken off his sweater, which he was using as a painting rag, blissfully unaware of the practicalities of everyday life, such as keeping one's clothes clean, especially free from oil paint, which is impossible to move. So this is my set of 4 paintings, again belonging to my Fractured Landscape series, which was inspired by the waterfall polyptych of Fred's. And it's one of my favourite works of his, and I felt I wanted to create something equally dramatic, but with my own insight, both for the pleasure of executing it and as a tribute to Fred. And if we go back to Fred's work, we can see the delicious mix of colours in soft pastel tones down the cliff face, contrasting with the deep dark indigo mystery, which is the waterfall itself. And then the pale yellow of the plateau above with a few flecks of dead tree stumps. You feel the bright light of the Australian sunshine on those exposed surfaces and the cool darkness of the caverns behind. The Williams paintings are quite large, 152.5 by 121.9 centimetres. And although I have used the same relative dimensions as Fred, mine are about 20 centimetres smaller. And as you can see, our colour schemes are not exactly the same, nor is the layout exactly the same. It was all about the general concept of the dark fractured interface in the centre, that is the waterfall, the plateau area above the fracture, along here in Fred's painting, and along here in my painting. It's not quite as obvious in my painting. And the way the waterfall broadens towards the lower part of the image. Not so much in this one, but in these it begins narrowly at the top and is broader at the base. And I've made mine broader at the base in 3 of them. Well, this one spreads out a little bit. Also, while the subject takes up a large area of the canvas in Fred's image, mine are more broken up and not necessarily the focus of the painting. It sort of holds it together, it centers it, but it's not as predominant in the painting as Fred's. And also, like Fred, I've used indigo for the shadows. In here, it looks black, but it's actually indigo. And it's not because I want to imitate him, but because actually the colour indigo, which he's used, is a colour I use always rather than the lifelessness of black, which is only ever experienced when there's a total absence of illumination. It's not a colour at all. So for me, indigo is almost a spiritual colour, because as you begin to add blue to it, it starts to take on a blue hue, but with nothing in it, it looks black. And yet it still has life. So those are my 3 inspirations that I wanted to share with you. And I think to be inspired by other artists without the need to emulate them, but simply to from what they've created that is your own, is a great gift. And I thank them for it. I wonder if you feel the same. If you're a practicing artist, have you ever tried to emulate another artist? And if so, did you consider whether it was because you aspired to be like them, which is impossible, or is it because they inspired you to continue your own journey with some insight into the way they see the world? Other artists can be such a great inspiration, but each of us has our own path. What is your journey? See you next time.